Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing story of Pensacola, North America's first place city. In this series of episodes, we're talking about the great fishing industry because Pensacola, of course, exists on the water. There are all sorts of areas for freshwater fishing, commercial fishing, deep sea fishing, contests. As we look at fishing in the 21st century, we see all sorts of stories in the summertime of huge fish being caught by sportsmen out in the Gulf. But fishing has changed radically in the time of Pensacola's life. Once upon a time, there were many more fish here, and unfortunately, we did not have in an earlier time an environmental campaign to restrict how much was taken from the Gulf. But nonetheless, the story of our fishing industry proceeded pretty much as we said in the last episode. We began a commercial industry here in 1870 when we had three functions present. The presence of a railroad to carry the catch away from Pensacola, commercially produced ice, which had not existed here before 1870, and then, of course, experienced men in the fishing industry who brought with them the proper equipment, basically the three-masted or two-masted smacks, which were basically built at that time, all of them being built at that time in New England. And so things began, first of all, with Sewell Cobb in 1870 and his company. In 1880, the arrival here of Andrew Fuller Warren and his company and associates, and then in 1882, Eugene Saunders and Thomas E. Wells. And so we had three enterprises at work. The Warren Company had its operations on the Balin Street Wharf, and the other two companies on the Palafox Street Wharf. And so things continued. Now, at this time, we need to take a little bit of a look at what a fishing smack was like and how the people worked and how they lived. A typical smack was about 100 feet long. It had a working maximum total of about 100 tons, and it was built basically to operate entirely by sail. And of course, the compartmentalizing of the vessel allowed for a heavy load of ice that went with them as they went out to try and protect the fish as they went. And of course, a typical voyage in the 80s and 90s would be between 20 and 30 days. A typical smack would have 11 or 12 fishermen. There would also be a mate and the captain. Of course, the captain was the master of the vessel. He was usually, a captain would have been a long-time employee of the fishing company. And the company entrusted their vessel to him, and these men would go out, and they'd be out 20 to 30 days as we traveling by this time 400 to 500 miles off Pensacola into the Campeche area in the Gulf. These men would stay out. They would be using all sorts of equipment, and it changed from time to time, particularly depending on where the fishing was. Generally, these men used what the fishing trade called hand lines, or they would drop their line down with hook, baited hook, and draw the fish up by hand. But in some instances, they were using netting. And the nets, generally, by the time we're talking about, were being produced either in Chicago or in Philadelphia. The R.J. Ederer Company in Chicago was one of the major producers, and the Paul Fish Net Company in Philadelphia was a competitor, and they had representatives all along the Gulf that dealt with this trade. And of course, handling fishing netting was a very essential part of the work that these men did, because the nets were expensive and keeping them in good trim was important. Okay, a typical crew now of 11 or 12 men was sort of unique, and this changed a little bit as time passed. Originally, some of the men who were on these crews came with the company owners, came down here from New England, but gradually that faded out, and more the people who were employed were regular folks, and they sort of floated. Now, as we get into the late 1880s and 90s, we also now are seeing the regular arrival here of Scandinavian vessels that were coming here to carry away lumber, that finished lumber going to Europe. Now, some of these men on those vessels came ashore. They liked what they saw, and they saw that it would be a very simple thing to translate their sea experience from a transport vessel into working on a fishing vessel. So many of these people did that. But as we move into the middle 1890s and beyond, And the population of Pensacola began to grow, and the business interest began to grow. There was a shortage of men for this kind of work. People found that being away from their families or being out for 20 or 30 days wasn't the most desirable thing in the world. So they would move off into something else. Well, this created a problem, and there are a number of stories of this, and I got some of mine as I tell it to you today from a man named Francis Taylor, who was the final owner of the Warren Fish Company. Francis would say that back in the early part of the latter part of the 19th century, early 20th century, what would happen was this would be a matter of scheduling. They would always schedule the fishing vessel to leave Pensacola early on Sunday morning, which meant that late on Saturday night, 3 or 4 of the husky members of the team, of the crew, would go out, and as they would see some potential crew member come out of one of the bars and saloons, well, weaving back and forth, a little bit tipsy, they would sneak up behind him, put a blanket over his head, or tap him on the skull, if you will, carry him to the vessel, and the next morning, about 10 o'clock, he might wake up and find that he was about 3 hours worth of sailing time out of Pensacola, and he was on his way to 20 or 30 days' work on the sea. And this has happened a good deal. Francis Taylor laughed about it. He said people used to say, well, why didn't these people complain to the authorities and so forth? Well, the authorities were cooperative. They sort of turned their back on it. Now, another thing that happened in this same period, and related to one of these companies, was that a linkage between the fishing companies and the lumbering period. Early on, as the vessels arrived here from Scandinavia to pick up lumber, they made the westward voyage in ballast. That is, their holds were filled with basically rock a lot of it granite rock taken off of mountains in Scandinavia. And when they got here, of course, they had to get rid of that. And at first they tried unloading it and literally carrying it by wagon over into East Hill, where they just dumped it. But that was slow and laborious and costly. So in 1885, the City Council and the E.E. Saunders Company came to an agreement. The Saunders Company got a contract from which they would literally have men who would unload the ballast, unload the rock, place it in the bay right adjacent to the shoreline. They would pile it up higher and higher until it came to almost the water's edge, water's depth, and then they would cover it with clay and then with sand, and bit by bit, moving out to the south and then, of course, to the west, they began to create new land. And the Wells Saunders Group did this for a number of years, and they literally created about 16 square blocks of new land for Pensacola, all of it south of Main Street. So when you walk down, for example, to where the new Maritime Park is going to be, maybe we should say where the Maritime Park is, when we, depending on when this is seen, that land on which the park was built literally was made land, created in the way that I've just described. Okay, we move closer to the 20th century, and the things are beginning to change. Mr. Sewell Cobb, who had been the innovator, the first man to come here in the fishing industry, he was growing old. He had had a very successful career. He had had a wonderful career as a public servant, appearing in many different economic development activities and civic activities as well. He was getting old, and he decided to sell out. And he sold all of his interests, including his vessels, to the E.E. Saunders Company. That meant that now Saunders, all of their operations were already Sewell Cobb's and Saunders were on Palafox Pier, so they simply integrated the two and put it all together. And that is exactly what happened next. So now Saunders Company became the largest of these organizations. Now, as they proceeded, the Saunders Company, and then the Warren Fish Company as well, felt that it was getting more and more expensive to buy new fishing smacks from the builders in New England. Plus the fact that there, in and about Florida, there were a number of companies, other than the ones here, that were in commercial fishing. And so there were companies in Florida that were beginning to build new style fishing smacks. And so Warren and Saunders both turned to them, added these new vessels to them, And then, of course, the question came up about how are we going to keep these vessels in good repair? This was something, of course, that they had dealt with from the beginning, but now it was becoming even more a problem for them. And so basically, the E.E. Saunders Company built what they called the Marine Railroad. Now, this was not a commercial railroad running freight trains or anything like that. The Marine Railroad was a ways on which a fishing smack could be literally pulled out of the water so that work could be done on her bottom. And this was a very successful venture, went on here for about 20 years. This was a companion, if you will, to the Bruce and Ollinger Yard, which of course had existed for years over on the Blackwater River. And Bruce Shipyard then, about the time we're talking about, was reorganized and moved to Pensacola. And it operated right on the waterfront. It was another repair shop. And when we talk today about Bruce Beach, well, of course, that is where the name Bruce came from. The Bruce Beach is largely where the Bruce dry dock was and ship works was placed. Okay, we move into the 20th century, and the operation is growing. The demand for fish is great, and a report in one of the major publications of that time gave a kind of a good overview on what Pensacola's fishing industry was. It said that basically overall there were about 800 men and a few women employed in Pensacola's fishing industry. Now this meant on all phases of it. This meant in the fish house. It meant on the vessels themselves. It meant as people who would go out and do a little in the marketplace on salesmanship, because of course, like anything else, there had to be a degree of marketing in places like Cincinnati, Louisville, Chicago, and this was done too. Now, what kind of return did this bring? Well, this same report said that for the year 1900, the fishing industry here was worth about $500,000. Now, in 21st century dollars, that would have been much, much, much larger in purchasing power and sales dollars, but it was a great sum for the year 1900. And of course, all of the men who were the principals in these businesses were not only operating in fishing, but they were taking the monies that they made, they were developing this capital, and they were moving out into other ventures as well. So when we talk about Warren and Stearns and Hayes and Taylor and Saunders and Wells and all of these people, all of them, you would find in this period, you would find them sitting on the boards of directors of banks, of lumber mills, and all of the things that were going on. It was a sort of an interlocking directorate, if you will, of men who had made money in fishing, and they were wise enough, of course, to invest it that way. They were good public servants as well. Thomas E. Wells, for example, at one time or other was the Commissioner of Public Safety. He also served as the city's mayor on several occasions, and he was the kind of man that people could come to for help and assistance. And his sons, of course, would continue the business well into the 21st century. His sons, Thomas Jr. and Frank, became very able citizens as the 20th century proceeded. Well, the fishing industry itself changed with the time. By the time we get to the year 1900, the old-fashioned way of carrying fish in a boxcar was beginning to change, mainly because of the work of a company whose people have a plant and organization in Pensacola today. That was what was then called 20th century called the Armstrong Cork Company. Today it is Armstrong World Industries, and it was that company through its scientists that began to develop what we would today call an insulating board. The first one that they made was made by baking finely ground particles of cork, and cork board insulation put in these boxcars. Yes, boxcar for the fishing industry was like a miracle, because it allowed the car with its initial cargo of ice, placement of ice, to move much farther north, and thus cut the expense of making a shipment of that kind. And the insulating quality that was developed for the fishing industry proceeded on, and of course moved into vegetables and all of the other things in other parts of the country. So step by step, fishing was becoming more modern. The netting was better. The availability of navigational tools was better. Everything was going just fine, and until we came to a problem, and that problem began for the Saunders Company in the year 1906, and we'll talk about that in our next episode.